Jenny arrived in Julian in 1870. Her husband John met her in town. Now he'd been there for several months. She'd just come from their home in Kansas. The thing that brought them to Julian was the promise of gold. Well, of course, they'd missed out on the big gold rush in Northern California, but there were stories of a gold rush in Julian. And John said that he'd come out, check things out, maybe get a stake in a mine, and if things looked promising, he'd send for Jenny. And that's exactly what he'd done. Promising, that was the word that John had used. Now, John was a good man, and he was a hard-working man. Every day he went out and worked that claim on that mine, but he didn't have a lot of luck. A lot of the miners didn't. And just when it seemed like things couldn't get any worse, it did. There was a collapse of a shaft in the mine, and Jenny was left a young widow. Well, at first she thought, well, that was it. She was going to have to go back to Kansas. She could stay with her sister and brother-in-law for a while till she figured out what she was going to do. But then she thought, oh, I've still got that claim, that stake in that mine, and well, I'm as smart as any miner, and I'm as hardworking as any miner. I'm just going to work that claim myself. And so that's exactly what she did. And it was true. She was as smart as any miner, smarter than many of them, and she was as hardworking as any miner. But as it turned out, she was about as lucky as a lot of those miners, which is to say, not very lucky at all. And after a while, she realized that that claim just wasn't going to pan out the way she'd hoped. But she didn't want to leave Julian. She'd fallen in love with Julian, and she thought, surely there's something else that they need here in Julian. And that's when Jenny opened up a bakery. She'd always been a good baker, and she had some great recipes from her grandmother. And so she started making bread and scones and cookies and cakes and pies, wonderful, wonderful pies. And people loved the things that Jenny made in her bakery. But you know, a lot of those people in Julian, they didn't have a lot of disposable income for things like treats like apple pie. So Jenny often found herself with a lot of unsold goods at the end of the day. She didn't want to let them go to waste, so she would take them out to people that she knew would appreciate them and needed them. And they were grateful and very appreciative. But gratitude and appreciation, those don't pay the bills. And so finally, Jenny added up the assets, and she thought, yeah, I'm just not making it here. I'm going to have to close the bakery and go back to Kansas after all. Well, she was a frugal woman, and she didn't want to just abandon everything. There were some ingredients still left in the bakery, and she thought, well, I'll just see what I can make with those. And so she looked around, and she got together the ingredients that were left, and she found that she had just enough to make 3 pies. 3 good apple pies. And when she pulled those pies out of the oven, she looked at them and she thought, I do believe these are the best pies that I have ever made. Well, now, she couldn't eat 3 pies all by herself, and so she took one to some people down the street who had 6 children who were always hungry and loved pie. And the second pie, she took over to an old couple who'd been so kind to her when John had died. But the third pie, well, that was dinner. Why not? She decided to make an occasion of it. So she set the table, she got out a china plate and a silver fork that she'd inherited from her grandmother. She sat down, she looked at the pie, and she prepared to cut herself a nice big piece of pie. And that's when it happened. The cabin door opened with a bang, and wind swirled in, swirled around the cabin, and then swirled out, carrying the pie with it. Well, Jenny ran out just in time to see her pie disappearing over the treetops. She said to herself, boy, I haven't heard of a pie in the sky, but I never thought I'd actually see one. Well, she went back into the cabin, but well, the pie was gone. She had nothing to eat. She was hungry. And now she was angry, too. I think they call that hangry. And so she just took herself right down to the courthouse, where she ran into the judge, and she said, I have been mightily wronged. I am a victim of theft, and I'm going to sue. Well, now, little lady, said the judge, tell me all about it. So she told him all about it, about the wind and the pie, and how the pie was, well, yeah, gone with the wind. And she said, I'm going to sue. And he said, well, so wait, "You're gonna sue the wind?" She said, "Yes, I am." He said, "Well, I don't know what kind of satisfaction you can offer," but she said, "Well, you can draw up the papers though, right?" He said, "Well, I guess I can." So with the help of the clerk, they drew up all the papers, all the important legal documents with the party of the first part, party of the second part, the whereases and heretofores. And of course, legally, they had to inform the entity that was being sued about the impending lawsuit. They didn't know quite how to do that, but the clerk stepped out onto the steps of the courthouse and he read the document to the wind, and he gave the wind 24 hours to respond. Well, the 24 hours passed with no actual response from the wind. Well, there were a few flurries and some rustling of leaves, but nothing that was actually intelligible. So they decided to go ahead with the lawsuit. Well, that day, that courthouse was filled with people. They wanted to see how that was going to turn out. Jenny versus the wind. And they were just getting ready to start with the legal proceedings when the door of the courthouse opened up and in ran the sheriff. He said, "Good news, we got the robber. He's in the jail right now." Everybody looked over at him. He said, "Well, you know, the robber, the string of bank robberies started in San Diego, then Ramona. Well, today, the robber was here at the bank of Julian, and he got all the money, and he took off running. He was a pretty fast runner." Of course, the bank clerk followed, but he wasn't a fast runner. And then one of my deputies, he chased after him too, but looked like that bank robber was going to get clean away. And that's when it happened. Yeah. Somebody said, "Well, what happened?" He said, "Well, that was the craziest thing. Just fell right out of the sky." They said, "What fell out of the sky?" I said, "Well, that's what was called crazy. It was a pie. It landed right on his head, knocked him out cold, and my deputy was able to catch up to him, put the cuffs on him, and take him back to the jail. He's there right now." Well, Jenny had heard all of that, and she said, "A pie, you say? What kind of a pie was it?" Well, the sheriff said, "Well, I don't think it really matters, but it was an apple pie." And Jenny said, "Do you have the pie?" And he said, "Well, of course I have the pie. We confiscated the pie used for evidence when we bring up that bank robber on charges." He said, "I've got it right here in my satchel." And he pulled out the pie, and Jenny said, "That's my pie." And the judge said, "Well, now how can you tell? All the pies look pretty much alike." And she said, "Well, I can prove it. Just look on the bottom of that pie tin. I always scratch the name of my bakery on the bottom of the pie tins." And so they held up the pie, and sure enough, it said, "Jenny's Pies." "Well, then I guess it is your pie, and so I'll give it back to you. You know, considering what it's been through, it doesn't look that bad. You can probably still eat it." And the judge said, "Well, you got your pie back, so I guess that's the end of the matter." And the sheriff said, "Oh, no, not exactly. Because, you know, when that string of bank robberies started, well, they put out a call for anybody to apprehend the bank robber, and they said there'd be quite a reward. And so I guess, Jenny, I guess this is yours." And he reached into his satchel and handed Jenny a big sack of cash. Well, Jenny looked at that cash, and she thought it was definitely a sign. She decided to stay in Julian, which is what she wanted to do. She didn't close down the bakery, and with that infusion of cash, plus the notoriety of the whole lawsuit thing, well, everybody wanted to come to Julian, and everybody wanted to buy Jenny's pies. And so I imagine that all of you are here because you know about how famous the Julian apple pies are. You've heard about that. But I bet you haven't heard this story. And the reason you haven't heard it is I made it up. But the story does have a moral, and that's a moral that was supplied by ChatGPT. The moral to this story is crime doesn't pie.